Hey guys, hey brothers and sisters, welcome back to Esoteric Psy, the podcast and website institution in general, where we strengthen and increase the consciousness of our community through sharing a dialogue of esoteric wisdom, psychology, and spirituality in a practical way so you can apply it in your day-to-day life in this moment. I am Dr. Alex Saldana. I am a medical doctor, Ayurvedic practitioner, and we have with ourselves here Miss Maddie. Maddie, tell us a bit about yourself and tell us about this awesome topic we have in store today.
Hey everybody, it's a pleasure to be here talking to you all. My name is Maddie Elizabeth. I'm a philosopher and a spiritual life coach, and I'm happy to bring today the topic of social engineering and mass manipulation by means of the media. So we're going to be talking about the range of ways in which this deception occurs to manipulate individuals, manage social change, and regulate the future development and behavior of a society.
That was very eloquently explained. You're making me look bad, but I like it. So I think we should start with a little bit kind of psychology of kind of the history or the psychological history of this leading up to Noam Chomsky and basically how he summed everything up and how he explains everything in such a beautiful way. Should we begin kind of with Gustave Le Bon and his early work? Because when he came around in the kind of late 1800s, even though when he wrote his book, which actually was The Crowd, a study of the popular mind in 1895, he was actually quite old when he wrote this book, because I think he lived to be like 90 years old. He was quite long lived for his time frame, right? He's actually known as a father of crowd psychology. So he comes up with some very basic or interesting concepts. He was around in a time where crowds were psychology and general like thought was based around kind of hypnotism. Like there were the eloquent, intelligent people. They were obsessed with psychology, specifically psychology of crowds, and like this whole like mesmer and hypnotism things. So he came up with some basic concepts, which were basically the crowds, rather than individuals, maybe induced to run the risk of death to secure a triumph for glory and honor. So this was about inspiring people. He was like actually obsessed with how great things can be done in war with like military people, in order like someone could actually sacrifice themselves in a glorious and an honorful manner for a crowd, right? He found this to be incredible, how someone can sacrifice their own life. So when individual, he also came up with, I'm gonna not quote him contextually, I'm trying to sum up a lot of his ideas, right? So he also came up with the concept of when an individual is in a crowd, he becomes a machine, right? In a crowd, every sentiment and act is contagious, and the individual becomes a spawn, ready to sacrifice his own interest for that of a crowd. So have you found this to be true? Like everything I've mentioned, have you observed this in crowd psychology?
I believe that I have observed this, especially after taking a deeper look into Le Bon's philosophy of crowds. And I think also, not only does an individual become a machine and becomes willing to sacrifice his or own purpose or meaning or value that he might ascribe to his own life and gives that up to the community or the crowd. And that sense of individuality and authenticity is lost to the crowd because there's such a deep devotion and commitment to the ideas that are brought about to this crowd, you know, by the people that you mentioned, like the elites or whoever's bringing these ideas to the crowd. They just succumb to the ideas without even questioning them, really. And so they really, really lose their sense of self through this.
Yeah, I can definitely see this. This obviously is human tendency, so it's not limited to a certain time frame. But this book was written over 100 years ago, like 130 years ago, I think. So it's interesting how I can see this in political movements today, in ideologies, right? How people identify with certain crowds. Well, he also kind of explaining or summing up his theory. He also makes a couple of very interesting remarks. Says a crowd can only understand simple ideas. An original great idea must be simplified to become popular, thereby losing a great deal of what made it good in the first place. And the person who actually presents the idea to the crowd, someone who should be a more advanced thinker in order to actually simplify this idea, right, should be the leader. And the leader must arise to simplify these ideas, but his true intentions are unknown. And these ideas have a tendency to be taken as divine and therefore greatly misunderstood. This was before atheism was like so big in our society, right? He says, even atheism would exhibit all the intolerant ardor of religious sentiments. And that's true. Like nowadays, you see these prevalent atheists who argue with like this religious order and kind of totalitarianism, or they just believe that that is the truth, right? And their religion becomes atheism in some way, you know. And though crowds are capable of good and evil acts, since it is our primitive instincts which drive us to join crowds, and the crowd provides a safe space for us to free of consequence to gratify these instincts. So this is essentially him saying why crowds can actually turn evil in a certain way, or more so, even though they have like these grandiose, like brave acts, this capability of sacrificing themselves for the greater good, they also have this other dark side to them, where we can kind of bring out our primal instincts, right? And this makes sense. I don't know what you think about this, but like the reason why we're attracted to join groups is because it made our survival easier. So obviously, social acceptance is something that's going to be incredibly prevalent in our society, because we have this ancient part of the brain that says, yeah, if you're in a group, it's more likely that you're going to survive. And it is true, right? What do you think about this?
Yes, no, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you're saying here. And it's also, I think it's important to remark that as well as ameliorating that like sense of acceptance that we will automatically receive being a part of a community and a group, it also relieves us of this sense, getting a little existential here, but it relieves us of this sense of like having to take responsibility for our own lives. And like it relieves us of that burden, because sometimes it can be a burden. Like freedom is a burden. Individuality can be burdensome in the sense that we have to like define our lives and define meaning. But when we enter into a group, it's like there is that automatic sense of like, okay, there's meaning here. We all have this unified sense of values, and we're all here working towards something together.
Yeah, then that's actually what you mentioned is actually another concept that Le Bon had, right? It is true. I think we've all felt it, like you said, this feeling of being responsible for our own life and how it can be overwhelming, right? Maybe you didn't have the best father figure, right? And even if you did, or mother figure, whoever was your figure of kind of that taught you how to handle life, right? Maybe even if you had this awesome father figure, maybe they didn't teach you exactly how you should do that yourself, or you didn't have enough confidence. If maybe it's your first time actually having success, or actually being a strong person, it's incredibly like the first time you try, you take these huge risks. It is daunting, right? And I think this is actually a direct quote. The tyranny exercised unconsciously on men's minds is the only real tyranny, because it cannot be fought against. So he's actually mentioning how this can so easily get out of control, get out of hand, and be used to manipulate people. And he has probably observed this happening, right? But it's not really until a little bit later on, which we're going to talk about, where this becomes kind of a science of manipulation. Who's our next kind of author here of great weight in this whole topic of group psychology.
Are we going to go into Noam Chomsky?
I think Freud might be better. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Freud sounds great.
I think Freud, he wrote a book in 1921 called Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, right? So he took actually ideas of Le Bon and other previous authors, and he said he criticized them. He said, okay, they're correct here, but maybe, but I have some other ideas about this, right? So he took a lot of the thought that he and his contemporaries, right, all the psychoanalysts had, and he developed kind of this group psychology theory, right, which introduces certain concepts, such as, the suggestibility of groups. So what Le Bon was saying here, where we have to simplify an idea in order for a group to understand it, because a group isn't intelligent, basically, which was what Le Bon was saying. He phrases it that they're suggestible, right? Something becomes easier to believe in within a group. So once an individual becomes part of a group, there's certain critical faculty which is kind of lost here, right? So it's the same line of Le Bon's thinking, but he just gives it a specific name. He also comes up with this concept of contagion, which is a rapid spread of ideas, emotions, and attitudes across groups. So in this, he comes up with this idea of like a virus spreading through society. Like an idea is a virus which is very rapidly spreading. And it's not just an idea, like it can be a sentiment, an emotion, an attitude, right? How have you observed this in general modern day? The fact of ideas spreading like viruses and attitudes spreading like viruses throughout a social group. Have you seen this in your day-to-day?
I would definitely say so. And I think it's so easy for these things to spread once, like Le Bon mentioned before, that this is a type of tyranny that's kind of exercised on man's mind. And it's so easy to spread because, like he mentioned, it's unconscious. Most of these ideas that we accept are ingrained into us through socialization. And it's, like we believe them. And when it's unconscious, we're not even aware that we believe them. So it can be very dangerous, I think, to absorb all these ideas and beliefs that are spread throughout a group. You know? I think you were muted.
You are correct. And he actually mentions how there's a higher rate of variability and morality. So extreme acts of good and extreme acts of apparent evil are more common, right? So acts of selfishness and evil can be merged into group. And he says this is because there's this concept called kind of a primal horde, in which there is a association within a group such as a brotherhood, right? So this concept of a primal horde is very interesting, right? So the first variability is because the conscious mind kind of gets shut off, right? So it's very easy for kind of the snowball effect to happen. So this negative sentiment or this positive sentiment, which can lead to bravery, or the negative sentiment, which can lead to like violent, horrible, kind of primitive animalistic acts, right? Kind of will build up very quickly, since this kind of cognitive ability is diminished in a group. It's so easy to get caught up in this like a snowball effect of rapid ramping up of emotions, right? The primal horde more so says kind of, because there's this concept of family, which is so ingrained in our psyche, since probably because it was very instilled in us when we were very young. So the concept of equal status, like brothers and sisters, and we can see this in like religious institutions where we say, hey, brother, hey, sister, and they even mention sometimes the preacher, they call it father, right? So there's certain archetypical roles of the father figure, which is the leader of the group or whoever has the group's attention, who was leading the group temporarily, and everyone else, which is equal, right? So this is very interesting because the father figure is more morally flexible. He has less restrictions put on him, so he's like held up to a different ideal than the rest, right? he has the ability to do different things than the rest of people do. This is actually common that a politician or that some leader will not kind of be held responsible for his actions, right? Or will be held to different standards, which is changing a bit now. But obviously, throughout time, it's a very prevalent idea. And even now, I think it's still a very prevalent idea. I think there's this, recently, there's been kind of this stigmatization of leaders who abuse their powers, which is, I think is good because they're held to the same standards, right? But this, I think it's been, excessive because not all people get put up to the same level, right? So sometimes they have even higher standards for leaders, and they're humans too. What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I think that like all of these authority figures, people that we perceive that hold like all the power, it's so dangerous to just like put them on a pedestal and hold them to such high standards, because then it's like these people are so, it's so easy for us to allow them to influence us and like kind of just take in whatever they say. Like whatever they say is law, basically. And that can be dangerous to society and also to an individual.
Yeah, definitely. So they also have this concept of, this father figure or this leader being kind of the great equalizer, right? Because let's say, we're listening to someone give a great speech. We're all the same compared to them, right? So there is kind of this justice happening, or kind of social equality happening, when we're all the same compared to this one dude, because he's got all of our attention, right? So we're all the same to him. And there is kind of a poetic wisdom of like the only, I think, true equality that's possible is kind of that temporary group equality. But it's not complete, because obviously there's just one guy that's held to different standards and leads us, right?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely like an illusion of equality almost.
Yeah. And I think the last concept that Freud introduces as actually very incredibly interesting and relevant is this concept of an epic poet. So there's someone that comes in and tells us a story, right? And inspires us, and this poses a danger to the leader, because they inspire us to imagine ways to try and become a leader, right? So they put us in this kind of hero role where we feel like we can rise up. And obviously, I mean, this inspiration can lead to us becoming a leader, which will definitely put the leader's role in danger, right? Who do we have next as far as like kind of the great thinkers of group psychology, before we go into Noam Chomsky and how he explains everything and kind of will help us understand a bit more? I think it's we had Le Bon, then we went into Freud, and I think we can go into Freud's nephew, right? Edward Bernays. Beautiful. So Edward Bernays was this pioneering mind, right? He was a proper mod. He came kind of with two books that were really interesting. I think Crystallizing Public Opinion, or Crystallizing the Public Opinion in 1923, and Propaganda in 1928. So he was a pioneering mind in advertising, modern propaganda, and public relations. He actually came up with the field of public relations. So he was an interesting guy because he did a lot of good, I guess, but a lot of bad as well. He was basically the guy that got women to smoke, selling cigarettes. Because like a long time ago, like smoking was considered to be a masculine thing, and most women did not smoke, right? So he was actually like sold the idea of cigarettes being empowering to women and a feminist ideal. So I mean, he was I don't know. It's a very controversial if you speak about it, kind of in moral terms. But oh no, he basically developed techniques to control and manipulate masses, right? He was Freud's nephew, and he did build off a lot of ideas that Freud had with respect to group psychology. Let's see. the individual, so some of the concepts that he had very quickly was the individual senses the power of groups and derives feelings of potential power in identification with it, right? So here we can all see how when we go to a stadium, when we become part of a crowd, how that there's something in that kind of hypnotic mass. There's a mastermind which is formed, right? And I think several authors have kind of mentioned this masterminds when there's a group of people that have kind of united for the same ideal. There's this download that you get from it, right? So here he talks a little bit about this, saying that when you kind of form part of this group mastermind, there's this power with it, right? Now, this isn't a very intelligent mastermind. He's just talking about this very primal instinct. I don't know, have you ever been to kind of a sports events and kind of cheered on and got intoxicated by that whole crowd thing?
Yes, although I feel as though for me, a more potent example would be like going to a concert, like being a part of this huge audience that just gets so lost and, like you said, hypnotized and entranced. You know, it is very powerful.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good idea, pretty good explanation of it, right? Yeah, we get so entranced, and there's power in being part of the crowd, because it's obviously incredibly difficult for an individual to change the world. And an individual cannot change the world if he doesn't get people behind his idea, right? Whether consciously or subconsciously. So this, like you said, this whole concept, which we talked about earlier, and you mentioned that an individual feels a huge burden of the world on his shoulders. But when he's in a part of a crowd, this burden is diluted. So he feels much more powerful and capable because he's got like backup in some sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's just like this huge sense of comfort because you know deep down that you're not alone, in the sense that, you know, you are an individual and you do have these responsibilities, but when you're part of this huge group where everyone else kind of has the same exact situation going on within, there is this sense of relief and comfortability because, you know, you're not the only one experiencing these existential life questions and all these reflections and whatnot.
Yeah, and so this is going to take a dark turn. Even this is a direct quote from from Bernays, right? He says, "If we understand the mechanisms and motives of the group's mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it." So he phrases this as a question, like, is it now possible to control people if we understand how it is without them being aware that we're actually doing it? And this is kind of Machiavellian and macabre. I mean, it's dark, right? Because now you're taking this whole psychology to the next level and you're using it to manipulate people, right? I think there's actually a book like called Dark Psychology, which speaks a little bit about this, right? And it is dark. I don't know. What's your opinion on this?
I think it is very dark, especially as someone who is aware of the ongoings of this manipulation. Like to just be, you know, aware that this is happening to so many people that don't know about it. I feel like that's dark. And it's even darker when you have the information and you have the knowledge and you want to diffuse it, that these people are so closed off because they've been so deeply conditioned and manipulated to believe that, you know, they don't have the control, they don't have power over their own lives. They relegate
Yeah,
the power to these higher, I put that in air quotes, forces.
yeah, and Jordan Peterson was talking about this, and I think one of his videos where he mentioned how we associate, great people to be in positions of power, right? Like if you're a great person, you deserve to be in a position of power. However, like we have grown to associate just the fact that you're in a position of power. Oh yeah, if he's in a position of power, he must be a great person, and that's not true. There's so many people that are in positions of power that are really not great people, and we have grown kind of to adore the whole concept of power by itself. And I think this is why kind of power can corrupt, because people don't strive really to become great people in order to have power. They just kind of want power. And I think this comes from a big shift. I think, you and I have talked about this, like that a long time ago when we lived in tribes, when we lived in small towns, like you knew everyone in that town, your entire tribe, like they knew you from the time you were born to the time you died. So there was no faking who you were. Everyone knew who you were. So the culture was really about being someone. Like you had to become the person you wanted to become in order to get that credit. But when we moved into big cities, where, and more so with mass communication, like you now have just a couple minutes to get your concept of who you are through to a person. So the skill of pretending to be something or showing that you're something became way more valuable than actually being someone, or yield better results, right? So this was kind of the virus, was like the worst poison to humanity, because now we're not really focused on being and changing, more so on exposing this part of ourselves that we want people to know. I don't
So much yes. So much yes. Bringing all the truth to the light.
Yeah, it's toxic, but it's where we're at, and I think we got to acknowledge where we're at in order to change.
Yes, and I honestly think that this is such a great segue into Noam Chomsky. If you would like to go there, I know he created, well, he came up. Would you like to give a brief overview of the history, or just like who he is and how he derived the 10 media manipulation strategies that we're going to cover?
Yeah, definitely. But I think right now, the last topic that I want to cover of this one dude, sorry, I forgot his name.
Me too.
And it wasn't Gustave Le Bon. It was, oh, my notes. Oh yeah, Bernays. Sorry, Edward Bernays. He was a very famous dude. I forgot his name. But he said that the crowd does not mean merely a physical aggregation of a number of people. The crowd is a state of mind. So as long as one identifies with the group, their mind will behave with or will be affected by that group, even when no member of the group is present. So this is incredible now, because now we don't even need the group to be there. It's just our identity with that group that needs to be present in order for our behavior to be affected, right? And so there exists suppressed and therefore subconscious desires of the individual, because they don't fit into his or her self-image. And this is very kind of psychoanalyst, right? So we have a self-image and we identify ourselves in a certain way. So when there's something that doesn't fit into that self-image, right? Something may be desired, and we might want desperately that desire, but since we can't, there's like a shadow. Like we talked about the shadow last time, right? So here he's taking that concept of shadow, of everything we don't want to admit about ourselves, we don't want to accept about ourselves, and he's using that to manipulate people. So, for example, let's say someone represses that anger. So we're taught, because anger is uncomfortable to people, because, well, we can get angry and we can be kind of hostile towards it, right? So when this anger gets repressed in order to kind of be able to interact in society, well, now there's anger and rage that you can call up on that masses and manipulate them with. So anyone who's come express this, and like sexual frustration, anything that's repressed, and I think Edward Bernays mentions, for example, this whole concept of symbols, right? So the symbol is created. So a car, I want to buy a BMW. Oh yeah, why do you want to buy a BMW? Well, because it's a car needed to transport. Yeah, and it's comfortable. That's not really why you want it. Most of the time, people that buy these nice fancy cars, it's a status symbol, or it's a means to satisfy their wife, or blah 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 blah. Like something that BMW doesn't really represent just transportation; it represents something else. And so maybe the status symbol, which gives you power, maybe it's literally power for you, right? But since you don't identify yourself as this kind of power hungry, kind of oppressive dude, you will buy the BMW, and that's your subconscious desire being filled by the symbol, right? So he comes up with the concept of selling symbols to people, which is great as far as selling things to people goes. but horrible for what that actually does to a person as far as making them manipulable. Because this renders human beings manipulable when you're able to, when they adopt a belief in behaviors without them being aware of the driving motivation, right? So if we're able to actually go deep and introspect, we're able to understand kind of why we want something, right? So why do I want this so badly? Well, it's just a car. Okay, well, maybe it's more than a car to me, right? But when you're part of a group, this comes out the window. And he says, a successful propagandist must understand the true motives and not the content to accept the reasons by which a man will give for what they do. So basically, people will say they're doing some stuff for a certain reason. And if you're wise, you will understand that's not, most of the time, that's not the reason why they're doing it. There's underlying subconscious kind of shadow reasons why they're doing it. And they don't even know that that's true about them, right? They don't even take the time to analyze that, or they don't want to accept it. I don't know, what's been your thoughts on this?
Yes, and even like just relating it back to the group, it's like on our own, we don't want to accept certain things about ourselves. We don't want to come to understand the true reasons as to why we want something or why we do a certain thing. But I feel like in a group setting, in a community setting, it becomes more acceptable, and we can even channel those reasons into something like some huge group event. I'm trying to think, like maybe war, like starting a war, like we can channel all that anger into war. And so in a group, like that becomes justifiable in a way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because it's like clan conflict, right? He says each group considers its own standards ultimate and indisputable and tends to dismiss all contrary and different standards as indefensible. So this is where all this fragmentation of being identified with a group will lead to a conflict, because like in ancient times, this primitive part of our brain was our clan against this other clan. So our beliefs, our standards against their beliefs and their standards, and we're willing to die for it because this is all I know. These people and my identity with them is all I know. And as this now changes, like we're in constant like intermixing and mingling with other groups, with other identities. This is why this increases the likeliness for a violent conflict or clash. And why like this debate, this openness of trying to get to a bigger truth will be kind of chopped out of the consciousness of people, because it becomes like a warlike effort. And we can even see this like in sporting events, when there's one tribe or team against another tribe or team, and they're fighting, and it's a winner take all kind of situation. And this primitive instinct of when we used to go to war and everything, people have heart attacks after their team loses the championship. Why? It doesn't make sense. But when we actually, in our mind, it's actually a territorial loss. If your tribe lost, well, it kind of means you lost everything you had, and maybe your family was going to get raped, and you might get killed. So obviously, there's this fervor that goes along with that's attached to a sporting event, because it activates ancient parts of our brain. What are your thoughts?
Totally. Oh, getting so passionate about this. I love it.
So now I think is a good trends of going to Noam Chomsky. We can kind of transpose to him.
Awesome.
Who was Noam Chomsky? Like who?
So Noam Chomsky was a distinguished American philosopher. He was also a political activist and a professor of linguistics at MIT. And for over 50 years, Noam has been exposing the crimes of the United States military across the world. And he has actually devised the most common strategies for understanding the psychological tools in which, the media can manipulate the masses. And so he devised these, or he came up with these, or discovered these 10 strategies, so that we can have a deeper understanding of like how we're being controlled and why, and just like the inner workings of this manipulation. So yeah.
That's awesome. So let's start with the first strategy, because definitely he actually worked for the U.S. government, but he mentioned that everything he did, like he was just being funded by them, but because the U.S. government was kind of throwing money in advancing technology and theories and just funding a whole bunch of projects. And they didn't really care. It's, they're just funneling taxpayer money into advancing knowledge and technology. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So but he dedicated a large part of his time into like actually undercovering, like with, I forget the number of years that something becomes declassified. They just like, so he studied like all these classified US documents, and he was just incredible at, he can watch a news segments and understand what's the truth behind what the news is trying to feed you, right? So let's go over these 10 strategies, Miss Maddie. What's the first strategy? Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so strategy number 1 is the strategy of distraction. So within this strategy, the goal and objective is to divert public attention away from important issues and changes that are determined by the elites, like political and economic elites. And the technique that's really used behind this is just continuously flooding us with distractions and insignificant information. So this strategy is very essential to prevent the public from gaining interest in the transformative knowledge in the areas of like science, economics, psychology, neurobiology, and cybernetics that the government and that the elites have access to. But they want us, the goal is to maintain public attention and divert it away from what the real social problems are. So they really just want to keep us busy. And by keeping us busy with the daily like workings of our lives, we don't really have any time to think about these greater issues that are at hand.
Yeah, and so Noam Chomsky was great at actually understanding how this is done, like how they can apply this, because of course, this was kind of known for thousands of years by leaders that want to kind of control masses because they understand that the entire group is more powerful than they can ever be, right? So like there's a scene from Django Unchained. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, where Leonardo DiCaprio says, there's all these slaves in the plantations. What actually keeps them from killing and overtaking us? And he goes into like this explanation of how there's different levels of minds, but that's not true. What's actually true is, you can get someone, if someone's identified with a group and believes whatever you feed that group, they're not going to question it. And it is group psychology, and it's this group manipulation to its highest extent, because it is true, if they banded together, they could have killed and overthrown them, but they were just so overcome by fear and so yeah, definitely I think that's a very important one, and that's a strategy, and it's no secret. I'll know that this is what they're doing. And an individual, once he's taken by himself, is much more intelligent than a group like they've mentioned here. But that goes out the window. So what's the second strategy that Noam Chomsky mentioned?
The second strategy is creating problems and then offering solutions to instill this sense of trust in the system, right? So the system is going to create a problem to cause some type of reaction in the audience. And this is going to become the norm of the measures that we would accept. So for example, they would say, oh, let's create an economic crisis in order for the public to accept this as a necessary evil to solve some other problem that they created. So it's kind of like this just vicious cycle that's going on of like creating problems, so they're creating the problems and they're offering the solutions. And this is something that I think this is a link that people miss. Like people only see the solution offering side of things, and they don't see the problems that are created. They don't know that the problems are created by the people that are offering solutions.
Yeah, this is actually really important. Like, it's obvious that those running governments and those running are aware of this, right? Most of the people that are in the higher ups are not stupid people by any means, right? So obviously they can predict what's going to be happening. And if they can control what's going to be happening, it's obviously going to be much less of an effort and much less of a gamble to to figure out what problem to solve if they're creating it, right? The problem, reaction, solution, and this is just a way to control this, right? So, I think this is very important. These are not stupid people, and I think underestimating those in power is like just one of the greatest downfalls of the masses. Underestimating your enemy in general. So, what's the third strategy?
Okay, so here we have the strategy of gradualism, which is also known as the gradual strategy. And the strategy is pretty much lies in the name. So here we are making an unacceptable measure acceptable. And the way we do this is by gradually applying enough pressure for maybe, let's say, a few consecutive years. And this is done in such a way that any new form of like radical socio-economic conditions, any mal conditions. So like neoliberalism and how that was imposed in the 1980s and 1990s. We have the minimal state, we have privatization, mass unemployment, wages that do not secure decent income. All of these unacceptable measures are made acceptable because of the way that they are gradually fed to us, spoonful by spoonful, a little bit over time. So these changes, these radical changes that would have given a rise to revolution if they had been applied all at once, are now not causing any reason for people to get upset or revolt against these changes.
Yeah, there's two analogies that I like to come here. You're from Florida, right? So you've obviously cooked crabs or lobsters at some point in your life, right? Well, the reason that crabs don't realize like that they're being boiled alive is you have to turn up the heat just a little bit, so it gets hotter. It's gradually. They don't notice the change until it's too late. Another analogy is kind of is by Moshe Feldenkrais, right? Moshe Feldenkrais speaks about if you're lifting a 200-pound weight and someone adds a feather to it, you're not going to notice the feather, right? But if you just have your hand there and a feather falls on you, well, you're obviously going to notice a change in pressure, right? So yeah, this is just a natural tendency, and you don't even need to apply with groups. You can apply to your spouse, right? You can apply with everything. Just a gradual change over time. This positive or negative manipulation, yeah, it can be done.
Oh, I love those analogies. Such good illustrations. But yeah, so then the fourth strategy is the strategy of deferring. So it's just another way to accept an unpopular decision. And this is to present it as necessary, painful and necessary, in order to win over public acceptance at that time. So for the public, for the masses, it's way easier for us to accept a future sacrifice as opposed to an immediate sacrifice. And the public, the masses, we always have the tendency to accept naively that everything will improve tomorrow, especially because that's what we're being told. Like, oh, things are just going to get better. Things are always going to improve over time. And by kind of absorbing that statement, the sacrifice that we're bound to face, we believe that it could be avoided. And this just buys us more and more time to get used to the idea of change. So once the time comes where people realize like, okay, things just aren't going to change, we've already come to accept it.
So I think this is taking advantage of the natural kind of survival instinct of people to be disciplined in tough times. And it says, well, yeah, you need to be disciplined right now because it's going to get better, and but right now you need to survive. But that it's going to get better, we saw it in the Soviet Union. It doesn't come. They take their sweet time, and it's in the meantime they just take more and more rights away from it. So yeah, it's horrible and it's manipulative. And I think what would be our the next strategy, Ms. Maddie?
So the next strategy, number 5, is addressing the public the same way you would address a little child, which is so demeaning in my opinion. But you see lots of advertisements and ads that are targeted towards the general public, and they use discourse and arguments and rhetoric with especially childish intonation. So this is targeting the fragility like of our egos, as if the viewer, like us, the audience, were some creature of a very young age, or even if we were like mentally impaired. So the more you try to fool the viewer, the more childish the adopted tone. So if we're like receiving this tonality of information over time, we're just going to start to accept it. Why? Because if someone talks to a person as if she had the age of 12 years or less, then due to the suggestive quality of that statement, the other person is going to tend to respond or react without much thought or resistance, just like a 12-year-old would.
Yes, definitely. This is actually called the Pygmalion Effect, right? And the Pygmalion Effect speaks a great deal about this, which is basically people react how you treat them, right? So if you treat someone, if you're your spouse, if you're kind of jealous and you treat them like they're cheating on you, well, maybe sooner or later they're probably going to cheat on you because that's how you treat them, right? But if you treat someone like they're stupid, they're going to behave that way, right? And specifically in groups, since that there's not that conscious filter put on that. So yeah, what's the next one? Wrapping kind of this.
Yes. Number 6 is appeal to emotions rather than reason. This one is huge, honestly. This is a classical technique, and it just causes like a short circuit on any rational analysis, any critical, any logical sense of the individual. So we're losing our logical capacity to reason with ourselves. So we're not really able to utilize these parts of ourselves when our emotions are targeted. So when when people appeal to emotions, that also opens the door to the unconscious. And so it makes it a lot easier to implant certain ideas, desires, fears, and doubts and compulsions within us. And all of that just causes us to behave in certain ways that they want us to behave in, so that we can succumb to their control. And this is so easily done when emotions are appealed to. We all know that, when you're in an emotional state, it's difficult to perceive accurately,
Definitely, yeah. It's much easier to be impulsive, to be, for the conscious, logical mind to go out the window. Definitely when emotions are involved. So, that's been a strategy of propagandists for a while now. What's the next one?
So 7 and 8 kind of go hand in hand. So I will just marry those two and present them together. So number 7 is keep the public in ignorance and mediocrity. So their goal, their aim is to make absolutely sure that the public is incapable of understanding the advanced technologies and methods that they use to control and enslave us. And I'm going to quote Noam Chomsky himself here. He says, "The quality of education given to lower social classes should be as poor and mediocre as possible, so that the gap of ignorance remains very large, and that the lower class, it's impossible for them to achieve the knowledge base that those of the elites and the upper class would have." This keeps us in a perpetual state of ignorance and mediocrity. And then number 8 is encouraging the public to be complacent with this mediocrity, to be comfortable with their ignorance. Ignorance is bliss. So another facet of this technique is just making the public believe that being stupid or vulgar and uneducated is fashionable, while at the same time suffocating the culture and the science and the art that does not conform to the norm. Because these types of sciences, some of these art forms and these advanced cultures expand the mind outside the realm of the norm, and they don't want us tapping into that. So they're encouraging us to be complacent and, marry our comfort zone, basically, so that we don't question anything.
Yeah, I think that's so clear to see in sitcoms and reality shows, how becoming stupid has become fashionable, right? Not thinking it's just be a caveman or a cave woman. That's no problem, right? Why would you need to see things in a more complex manner? And definitely the public school system is really not the best in the world, right? Unless, like, you go into honors programs. There's like the basic quality of education in almost any country is, specifically larger countries, is very subpar. This whole thing of rational critical thought is not something that it's given much focus. More so in memorizing stuff and processes. And it's not a very, and they segmentize things, right? So I had a professor that, well, when I taught, because I taught everything from middle, high school, and university, right? So I had a professor that says, how does the government keep people stupid? Well, they compartmentalize everything. So it's math, it's just about math. History is just about history. Physics is just about physics. And they don't teach you how to connect the dots and apply everything in context to be able to use your rational thought. And I think there is a large truth to that. So any comments, or would you like to move on to the next?
Yeah, just a quick little thing. So just to piggyback off of that, those statements about the educational system today, I think Noam Chomsky even had a small little quote, and it says, "Education is a system of imposed ignorance." And so I think that definitely relates to that. So yeah, we can go ahead and get to the 9th strategy, which makes me extremely angry, honestly. This strategy is reinforcing self-blame. So with this strategy, they are making the individual believe that he or she is the culprit of their own misfortune, essentially. And so with this strategy, we believe, well, we learn to doubt our intelligence. We learn to doubt our abilities and our efforts. And this really keeps us stuck in the system, because if we are not believing that we're capable of greatness, if we're not believing that we're able to tap into some amazing intelligence that we naturally embody, we're going to be stuck in the system. We're not going to go outside the box. We're not going to jump outside of our comfort zone. So instead of rebelling against the economic system, first, let's say, the individual will devaluate and blame himself for his own downfalls, instead of the way that the system is structured to kind of promote these downfalls. And this leads inevitably to a depressive state within the individual. And there's a purpose to that. And the purpose is to stifle action. And without action, there is no revolution. So we're just kept small. And that's the way they want us to remain. Because again, it all just comes down to, like, they don't want to be questioned. They want people to be stuck and following. They want us to be followers. They want us to follow the herd.
Well, I think everything you said was incredibly true, but also we have to add, because in capitalism, this is something that's obviously just put out there, if you see all these people that are becoming millionaires, if you're not becoming a millionaire, it's your fault. And to a certain extent, I guess that could be understood as true, but you don't understand that the system is kind of rigged, right? So I'm not saying that not anyone can become a millionaire, with hard work, effort, intelligence, blah, 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 right? This is what capitalism sells you, right? And that is true, but we've kind of been taught that the system is fair, that it's not rigged, that it's not, there's not an element of luck, which there's a lot of elements to that, right? So we have this innate, like this ancient part of our brain that contemplates fairness and justice. And we're willing to participate in a game, right? As long as it's fair. But basically what these people in power are doing, not all of them, but most of them, are saying, hey, the system is fair. It's your own fault. And they're not realizing that, they just rigged the education system against you. They just rigged the political system against you. They rigged everything against you, but it's your fault, right? To a certain extent, I mean, there are obstacles. You can, I guess, get over them, but it's not a fair game. What's thoughts or the next one?
Yeah, I agree completely. Totally. So our last and final strategy, number 10, is for the system to, the strategy is that they understand individuals better than they understand themselves, meaning better than the individuals will understand their own, psychological processes and their functions of, their brain. So, comments?
This goes back to the fact that they are not stupid people. I mean, in order for someone to maintain power, to stay in power, they need to be very intelligent. And obviously, knowing you better than you know yourself, understanding all these strategies and implementing them in order to see your motivations, to use them against you, it is huge,
Yeah, especially like during the past 50 years with all these rapid advances in sciences, it all has generated such a growing knowledge, especially a knowledge gap between the public and the dominant elites with biology, neurobiology, applied psychology, and the system has enjoyed a sophisticated understanding of human beings that they can really use against us. And the system really has gotten a lot better at knowing the common folk than he knows himself. Hence their success in controlling the majority of us.
Yeah, especially because it's not simple or easy to get an education in all these fields, right? And it's not cheap to hire a specialist in these fields to actually, be able to enact and apply these concepts. So yeah,
Yes.
This definitely limits. Okay, so summing this up, we mentioned kind of in our mission statement in the beginning of the podcast that our goal here is to strengthen and increase the consciousness of our community, right? And who's listening to this or who's part of our lives is our community. So we try to do this, but we got to do it in a practical manner, which is also kind of included in our mission statement, right? So I think the big takeaway from this, or how we can avoid first falling into this, is not identifying with groups. And now this is easier said than done because we have a need for community. Now there's a difference between knowing how to interact and move in a community and not identifying yourself as that community. Ken Wilburn has this whole concept of growing up, right? And it's this concept of the lowest level is you're just a very selfish individual and you only worry about yourself and your needs, and it's just you, right? And then on the second level, it's your community, your people, your identity. This is where Nazis were at, fascists. They identify themselves with their race or their religion or their creed or their ethnicity, whatever. Kind of ethnocentric consciousness. And then you go higher and you identify yourself, with all humanity, and then kind of with all living things. And then, all consciousness in the universe, kind of this more spiritual sense, but it makes sense in this evolution of consciousness. So in this next level where you identify with all humanity and with all living things, if you lose the identity of I am Catholic or I am American or I am whatever, you start first being able to have your own identity, and at some point you even lose that, which is the whole transcendent spirituality, whatever. But there is, like, if you become identified with the group, like I said, it's not just the group being there. You identify with the group does not allow you to think logically, and this is horrible because there's no growth in the room for growth. So definitely, like all the listeners out there, what I would recommend as far as applying all this practical knowledge and not being able to be manipulative is not identifying yourself with any specific group. Even though there is a need for community and you will never really surpass that, we need to learn how to function in the community, but not identifying yourself as a group, I think, is the main point. And obviously cultivating yourself, learning and applying this critical process. I don't know, any comments that you have for our listeners as far as how to apply this or how to use this in their lives to not be manipulated?
Yes, so I can definitely share one technique or one little strategy that I've incorporated into my daily life to really not identify myself with every belief that is fed to me or every thought or idea, is to just question, like become a reflective being, tap into that introspection that is so valuable to us. And if you hear something on the news, if you hear someone say something that you don't entirely feel harmonious with or resonance with, ask yourself, like, do I believe this? Like, direct your thoughts into just like this reflective pattern, like, why do I, if you do believe this but you don't feel as though it resonates, ask yourself, why do I believe this? And kind of try to trace back to the origin of where that belief came into being. And so that way you can really come to understand it, and also just, yeah, not trust everything or believe everything that you hear.
Yeah, there's this concept or this phrase that says strong ideas loosely held. So once, I mean, you need to have a idea in order to move through life, right? You need direction in your life. And for that direction to exist in your life, you really do have to, have an idea and believe that. But once you're presented with something else, not be married to that idea, so you can progress as a person and maybe change the route or the direction of your life if you realize it's not the best or it's not the most complete. Uh, and I think that's very critical, not being married to your ideas, being, keeping your mind open, because, we can never really get to a higher truth if we just reject everything. Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much it. Would you like to give our social media? Would you want me to give them so they can reach out to us? Because we're on Patreon now, and our Facebook is facebook.com/Esoteric Psy EN as in English, because this is the English branch of Esoteric Psy. We're originally started out in Spanish, and we're branching this out. And our Patreon is also /Esoteric Psy. So if anyone wants to give any donations to keep this project going, so we can keep producing more videos, that would be awesome as well if you guys can donate. Also, do you want to give your own personal media?
Yes. So my Instagram, which is the platform that I'm really present on, it is ethereal.creatress.
Great, beautiful. So, yeah, I think mine is Alex Aldana, Integral Therapy. I'm a therapist, so if anyone's interested. So, this was it for Esoteric Psy. Any last comment before we close?
Don't think so. Just want to thank you all for being here, and we're so excited for our next episode.
Beautiful. So, this was Esoteric Psy, right? The website, institution, podcast where our purpose is to increase the consciousness and fortify our community through starting a dialogue of esoteric wisdom, psychology, and spirituality, practical way that you can apply in your day-to-day life. My name is Dr. Alex Aldana.
And my name is Maddie.
And we thank you so much for listening to us.